Welcome everyone. My name is Kunal Shah and this is the Kurious Show. This show is all about being curious about our world and learning through discussions with my guests from around the world. It's a privilege to introduce my guest today, Lina Zeldovich, and I'll keep the introduction brief so we can spend more time listening and learning from her. Now let me pull up her intro. Born in Russia, Lina Zeldovich grew up in a family of Jewish scientists, listening to bedtime stories about volcanoes and black holes. Now a prominent writer, editor, and Columbia Journalism School alumna, she has written about ecology, health, and sustainability for major publications in the US, Canada, and the UK, including the New York Times, Reader's Digest, Smithsonian, and many others. She now lives in New York City, and she has won 4 awards for covering the science of poo. And today we are going to be talking about her new book, The Other Dark Matter. And I can't wait to get into my questions. Welcome to the show, Lina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. It's my honor. So let me start with my first slide. And you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a roadmap that I am that I'm providing to the viewers so they can get an idea upfront or some of the themes that I plan to cover in this discussion. And if you guys, everyone, if this interests you, then stick around and you can learn more about this topic. So we are again discussing Lina's new book, The Other Dark Matter. My first question to you, Lina, what's your book all about? Could you please introduce us to your book?
Sure. So my book is about the wonders and values of poo, the substance all of us produce regularly on a daily basis, about a pound a day, and a topic that no one really likes to talk about very much.
Could you talk about, I'm interested in the Minoan civilization because I think you mentioned that's where this issue might have started from. So could you just talk a little bit about that and maybe any other that you think might be interesting?
So the Minoan civilization that dates back from about 2600 to 1100 BC. It's actually happened before ancient Greece. They were probably one of the first civilizations who built a form of a sewage system, kind of a very simple one, but it had gutters, and in many cases covered gutters that took water and wastewater and just waste in general out of the city. It operated on water, rainwater that people collected. It, the society had primitive toilets. They were in the houses or around the houses. And they had also a system of cleaning these gutters if they got clogged, for various reasons. There were sort of like these openings where they could go in, and clean, fix, and whatnot. So even today, when archaeologists uncover some of the cities, there are remains of this ancient, sewage system in a reasonably decent shape, given all the centuries. And it's pretty impressive how they managed to do it such a long time ago.
Yeah, that is quite impressive that, if something that's built so long ago and there are still remains, that kind of shows their engineering prowess. But now, if we come to the present status, the current situation about this crisis, in a way, it could be a crisis. Let me go to my second slide. You provide some really interesting examples and applications that, that people are coming up with these days, but I'm also interested in these concepts and these ideas. And I think one common thread throughout the book is this impact on the ecosystem and the balance that kind of, is impacted basically if the disposal system is not effective. So can you talk about this idea of redistribution of nutrients and tying that together to how ecosystems get out of balance?
So yeah, no, absolutely. So it's kind of a really tricky issue that I don't think too many people know about outside of maybe wastewater industry. So if you think about it, how we grow our food and what happens to it, in particularly, for societies that live in colder climates, like we here in New York. It's
Mm.
negative degrees out. Nothing grows
God.
right now in winter. So our food is trucked to us and flown to us and shipped to us by boats from other places, from warmer climates. In our case, probably Florida, Arizona, Mexico. Um, it's grown someplace else, and while it grew, it took the nutrients out of the earth, and then it's brought to us. We eat it and we excrete it. All these undigested nutrients, many of them remains in our excrement. That includes, fertilizers like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the classic, fertilizing trio. Where does it all go? We flush it. It goes to a sewage plant. The sewage plant processes it. In the Western world, at least, the water that comes out at the end is safe enough to put back in the environment, in a sense that it doesn't have pathogens in it, but it still has all the fertilizers.
Right.
And where does it all flow? To whatever body of water it goes to, lakes, rivers, and the ocean.
Mm.
So if you think, if you look at what we just did, but the mere eating, we took a bunch of nutrients from certain places and then we deposit them in the others. We don't return it back where the food grew. So we break that link that should happen in the ideal world. So what happens in this case, the fields get depleted because we never return the nutrients back. The bodies of water get over-fertilized and they start growing all the wrong things. In some cases, it's algae or toxic algae. In some cases, it's, things, for example, if that water ends up in the marsh, marshes grow different plants that shouldn't be growing there, and they start falling apart too. So scientists call this phenomena the redistribution of nutrients on the planet that many of us contribute to because we have to eat. Why is it a problem? Well, there are two problems. We deplete fields and we have to use synthetic fertilizer, which is expensive and polluting to produce. And in some cases, you can produce nitrogen, but there is a limited amount of phosphorus in the world, and it's hard to get. We might be running out soon, depending on what you read. And in the ideal fashion, we should put it back in the fields. Talking about eutrophication, so when we over-fertilize marshes in particular, plants grow almost too well. They grow very tall, but they don't invest in their root system because there's too much food. Why grow roots? And it is the plant's roots that hold the marshes together. What happens? Why the roots no longer hold the marshes together? There's no marsh, it's just mud. Why is it important? Who cares about marshes? It's not where we go for picnics, right? It's not where we go hiking like in the forest. Well, they're very important. Marshes, particularly the coastal ones, protect us from floods. Marshes is what absorbs the tide during storms. Marshes also is where fish grows, the little juvenile fish that then grows into a big fish that we eat. So by destroying marshes, we're destroying our food sources and we leave ourselves vulnerable to floods. What should we do in the ideal world? Figure out how to restore the circular agriculture.
Right. And so you are in the present scenario, you talked about so many interesting, fascinating examples. Can you share one if that comes to mind right now, or any that you like?
Yeah. So what it is we're solving the issue of human excrement. There's probably not going to be, actually, most certainly not going to be one fits all solution, because it very much depends whether you talk about a huge city like New York or, a smaller city, some place, far away from the coast, or a tiny little village someplace in Africa or India. Yeah, every solution will have to reflect the geography and the amount of new population living there. So in United States, my favorite was Washington, D.C., because they actually did exactly that. They restored the circular economy and the circular agriculture. It's just so beautiful how it works. So what they do when the sewage comes, into the plant, they cook it in this humongous pressure cookers at 300 degrees Fahrenheit and then 6 times the atmospheric pressure So all the pathogens are dead at the end. There's nothing alive left there. No E. coli, no salmonella, no nothing. Then that gunk is loaded up into biodigesters, where bacteria that normally is supposed to live in sewage chew through it, releasing a biogas, which can be burned to generate electricity or other things. And the rest, what comes out at the end, is basically mud, kind of like this wet mud you see on the riverbanks. So they dewater the mud, they dry it up, and they package it in the bags as fertilizer, which has a really awesome name, Bloom, because it does make plants bloom and produce great food. And people can buy it as organic fertilizer they made themselves and put it into their own garden. They certified, the process is certified that it is free and safe to use. That was my favorite here in America. In other parts of the world, these solutions probably won't work because you need to put down a lot of pipes. It could be expensive. It may not be enough, or maybe too much, to cook like that. So there, in a lot of places in the world, there's no sewage infrastructure, and it can't be built because it's either too expensive or there's not enough water. So it just won't work. But there are startups in Africa and India that are solving this problem from a different angle. They use service, as in people, that walks through the neighborhood and gathers the output of people's toilets, and they quite hygienic sealed containers or biodegradable bags. So and I've actually followed a service like that in Madagascar, and it was a completely fascinating to see this in action, and how much of a difference it makes in people's lives, because they no longer have to use latrines. They can use their own toilets. So the service comes in, they swap a cartridge or a bag from underneath the toilet, and they take the full one back to the processing plant, where it basically kind of works the same way. The waste is loaded up into a biodigester, much smaller. It goes through its process for some time. Out comes the biogas and fertilizer, which can be given to farmers or can be composted or fed to worms to create an even better compost. So this is just like two very diverse approaches that can be used in two very, very different societies. But then there's everything in between that you can do. Yeah.
Wow. Right. So can you talk about the farmers and how this issue relates to them, and what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So from the time immemorial, that was the issue. How do you take the mega output that the city produces and take it to the countryside? And it was almost always an obstacle. And the bigger the city grew, the further the farms were. And it's still true today. And different societies dealt with it differently. In the medieval Germany, in Berlin, in the middle of the city, there was a huge pile of shit, like sitting right outside some cathedral. And finally, the city issued a law that every farmer who came to the city to sell produce had to take a load home. Wow. It was mandatory. Wow. In the medieval and Victorian London, people built cesspools, and then they built pipes that took their output into the Thames, that led to the great stink of London. Because taking it out to the farms was just too far and too difficult. And it's a very common problem. A couple of societies who really figured it out, and perfected it, it seems, for the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Flemish, a tiny little part of Europe. And what all three had in common was that their soils were not good. They were barren. That didn't produce a lot of food if you didn't work very hard at fertilizing them all the time. And in this situation, it clicked. Farmers needed the city's poo and the city needed the farmers' produce. So they very painstakingly made sure that this circular economy worked, and they had very sophisticated and very well set up mechanisms of collecting people's night soil, or in Japanese shimagoye, from the residents, and taking them to the wharfs and loading them up to barges and covering them with straw so it wouldn't stink, and then sailing the barges to the countryside. And it was so important to preserve it all that people argued who gets to collect it where and who gets to sell it to who. And if farmers didn't have enough, they would go and steal it from other people, which is like, I mean, can you imagine this in our society? It's unbelievable.
No.
But that's what happened because it was so important for growing food. And maybe we can learn something from that wisdom and apply it to what we're doing.
This is a short story segment, which is, if you could share a moment, and this is something fun that I introduced, and any journalism story, or a writing process story. How was your writing process, and was it easy or anything like that?
Well, I love writing. This is what I do. So I'd say all in all, it was, it was very, very pleasurable. I love the topic. I really love the fact that I got the opportunity to tell people about it. It's a very, little known topic. So my writing process was very enjoyable.
Nice.
And in terms of a journalistic story, I'm trying to think. So there's probably a couple. One was in Madagascar, when I saw what difference it makes in people's lives. So people were telling me, so people, I've spoken to a couple of women who recently installed this toilets with this pickup service versus their latrines, and the first thing they told me, well, it's so clean when it rains and it floods, which is just all the time in Madagascar. The filth doesn't come out, it doesn't come into our yards, it doesn't come into our homes, it's all gone. And the other thing they kept telling, oh, even my 5-year-old can use it. And I'm like, what's so hard about using a toilet? You should see this Madagascar kids. They're so self-sufficient. They walk for miles to the nearest, a well to get water for their families. Of course they can use the toilet. And then finally they explained to me, so the old latrines, they usually not in a very good shape. Sometimes the floor is cracked, it's breaking. You go there in the dark in the middle of the night, little kids fall in and your kid is gone.
Wow.
And it was so horrifying. We don't think of these dangers. I mean, like, your kid is 2 and they can use the toilet, right? It really does make a tremendous difference. That was one story. And another story was actually in the New Delhi's Museum of Toilet. There's the Sulabs Museum, where there's this, they demonstrate this composting toilets that are set up in such a way that, for a year or so, your sewage, your sludge, like flows in one pit and accumulates there, then you cover it in compost and flows into the other. And so at the end, when you take the composted sewage, it basically looked like rocks that you can fertilize with and burn. And so there I am standing with the museum curator, who's like, here, touch it, enjoy it. I mean, it's compostable, it's safe. And it is, because you wash your hands afterwards. And I'm standing there holding this thinking, wow, it's really possible. It's really amazing. So those were 2 very memorable stories.
Wow.
For my recording.
That is pretty cool. I mean, I'm sure with your travels, you must have had so many cool stories, but thank you for sharing those stories. And now I am gonna bring up my last slide, which is, the future developments. You mentioned some medicinal uses, which are just amazing transformation stories that you talk about. And then there's this tool banks application. So is there anything particular, what would you like to talk about in the future developments area?
In what's coming up down the pipe? Yes. So in recent years, a decade or 2, I think the medical community realized that what's in your intestines is actually an ecosystem. There are like
Right.
trillions of organisms that live there, and most of them we need, for health and functioning in general. They not only digest our food, but they also release, various molecules that our body needs.
Right.
And they fight infections, they fight intruders. Um, in some people that don't have a very strong intestinal ecosystem or microbiome, the wrong bacteria can take hold and then they become sick. In particular, there is, really like nasty pathogens called C. difficile, and it can be very antibiotic resistant. And so in the US, a certain amount of people die from it. I don't remember. I think at the time I was researching the book, it was like 25,000 people. Um, and as a sort of an early, during the last decade, early on, people pioneered this method of dealing with a super bug by transferring the poo of healthy people into the people with that pathogen. And the recovery was so incredibly fast and so it just settled, and the bug did not come back, that it made doctors realize that it's actually a valid way of treating people, at least from this pathogen, but possibly from others. It's still very much in the research. It's still considered sort of like the treatment of last resort. It's not like your fully conventional treatment, but it definitely has started a certain movement. And so here in the States, in the state of Massachusetts, we now have a stool bank, which started as a little startup and now is, I think, a worldwide known entity that screens very healthy donors, for their stool donations. And if they pass, it's very hard to pass. It's easy to get into MIT and Harvard statistically than to be qualified to, save lives with your poo.
Wow.
And if you are qualified, then they ask you to donate for a certain period of time, which means you have to come on their site and donate there. And then they transform these donations into a substance that can be given to those who are sick. And, they have this request all the time.
It's going to be pretty exciting how all this develops. By the way, thanks for bringing the hat out. I really appreciate your hat. And my last question is your personal connection with the story. How did you get interested in this topic? I didn't mention it in the intro because I wanted you to explain how you got started.
Yeah, so I had a fairly unusual childhood than I think most other people, at least in the Western world. I grew up in Russia on my grandfather's farm, and he farmed like the Japanese and the Chinese. He fertilized our farm with our own sewage from our own cesspit, and so every fall he would open it up and start dipping those buckets into it. And I was, I don't know, maybe 5, maybe 8, and it was so interesting to me because I was not allowed anywhere near that cesspit because my grandma was afraid I was going to fall in, but I always wanted to see it because there's such a special occasion. It only happened once a year, like birthday, and only grandpa was allowed to go there. So it must have been something really cool. That's what the adults do, but they don't let you go there. And then I followed him around our farm and I grew food with them, during the year. It taught me a lot on how to grow vegetables. And one of his favorite sayings was, we have to feed the earth the way we feed people. And it made so much sense because we took from the earth every single year. You had to give something back. Otherwise, it would just end. There'd be, no nutrients left. And to me, it was so beautiful and so normal that I never developed, an aversion to the poo or sewage or whatever. Even the smell was sort of part of life. And when my grandfather opened up his compost pits, it didn't smell bad anymore. It smelled like a classic garden dirt, just like the bloom smelled to me when I was in DC. And so I grew up thinking that everybody does it. Everybody does the same thing, because otherwise what would they eat? So I knew that there were people who lived in big apartment buildings and they didn't have cesspits right there, but I figured just went someplace into a bigger cesspit. So imagine my shock when I grew up and I learned that that's not how it works.
Wow.
And so all the way up to the point when I started writing this book, I was always wondering, like, for how long can we go? We're going to run out of fertile places. And guess what? We are. It's
Right.
not, it's common. It's quite common. So
Right.
we made synthetic fertilizer, but it's polluting to produce. It costs a lot of money. It requires a lot of energy from fossil fuels. It's not the ideal way. The better way is to restore that circular economy. And so when I finally had the chance to tell the world about it, I wrote this book.
Well, and thank you for writing this book. I urge the readers to get the book. It's just so full of facts, stories. It's just really interesting. Now, is there any projects that in the future that now you're going to be working on after this project, or anything you can share?
Sure, but before I go into it, I just want to tell all of your viewers and listeners one really important thing. So I have
Yeah.
this poop ape, and you can read it.
Oh, I
It says,
am a
"I'm a
pooper.
pooper," and so are all
Wow.
of you. What you produce on a daily basis is not the yucky, disgusting gunk.
Right.
No, it's an incredibly potent substance.
Yes.
It's so incredibly useful. So you're all super poopers, all of us. We just have to do it better.
Right.
Um, in terms of what projects I have, yeah,
Yeah.
I have another book that I'm working on, which is also kind of on a subject not particularly well known.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but I'm in early stages, so I'm not going to get into like a deep discussion about it.
Right, right.
Um, it's about some other microorganisms that coexist with us on the planet that we don't know about very much.
Wow.
And at the same time, I'm working on other stories poo related. And I am hoping that those stories will, draw more attention to the book and to the concept in general. So I can change, people's perspective of their own organic power that we'll carry within.
Wow, that is awesome. Really look forward to your next book, but thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.